Hi everyone, and welcome to another Heroes and Bosses video. This time I'm painting the Orc Necromancer from Green Horde. These are the paints that I'll be using, and there will be a full listing in the description below. I'm starting off with a two-tone prime using Agrax White and Chaos Black. I first sprayed the miniature from below with a Chaos Black, and then I sprayed it from above at a 45-degree angle with the Agrax White. I'm going to use this as my guide for applying the skin tones. Right now I have two colors on my palette. The dark tone is a 3-to-1 mix of Xereus Purple and Slaanesh Grey. The lighter tone is pure Slaanesh Grey. I'm applying the dark tone to all the skin areas that are still covered in black, and the lighter tone to the areas that are covered in Agrax White. This is going to give a good head start to the highlighting on the flesh. So for this part I'm only using one brush, but I'm focusing on one part of the body at a time. I usually start off by painting the darker region first, then I rinse off my brush and switch to the lighter tone. So here you can see I'm first painting the underside of the left-hand side of the body and arm with the dark tone. I'm keeping my paint fairly thin, about half water, half paint. Now I've switched to the lighter tone and I'm painting the upper surfaces. Where the light and the dark tone meet, I'm just doing a simple wet blend. Then I'm just going to continue this trend around the rest of the flesh. The chest and the abdominal area is mostly covered in the white, but we can add more definition there later with a wash. Once the skin is finished, I'm going to paint the loincloth. I'll be using two colors for this, Mournfang Brown and XV88. I'm going to start off by painting the entire loincloth with Mournfang Brown. Now the color you see might not look like Mournfang Brown, and that's because it isn't. I started off with a lighter color and I didn't like it, so I repainted the whole thing with Mournfang afterwards. The loincloth is wrapping up over a belt at the waist, so you want to make sure you paint that part as well. So here's the loincloth after being repainted, and you can see it's quite a bit darker. Now I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade all over the loincloth. Now something I don't do often is to highlight before I have all my base colors on, but in some cases I will, such as if I'm using dry brushing for the highlights. I probably should have started with the loincloth, as dry brushing can be messy, but I'm being extra careful not to spill over onto the skin. I'm slowly going to build up the color on the loincloth with a series of dry brushes, the first one being with the original color Mournfang Brown. Next, I'm going to mix in a small amount of XV88 and do another layer of dry brushing. Each layer will get successively less heavy, but this is only the second layer of 4 that I plan on adding. So still being quite heavy with the dry brush, I'm trying to give this a rough, worn-out look, so each layer of the dry brush is going to enhance that look. Next, I'm mixing in a bit more of the XV88, so I have a roughly equal amount of Mournfang and XV88. I'm being a little more careful now, not going quite as heavy as the first couple layers, and I'm just trying to pick out the raised edges on the loincloth. Next, I'll follow that up with a 1-to-2 mix of the Mournfang Brown and XV88. For the final highlight, I'm dry brushing on some pure XV88. The next thing I'm going to do is paint the cloak. I'm using two main colors for this. The first one is going to be a 1-to-1 mix of Abaddon Black and Eshin Grey. The second color is going to be a 1-to-1 mix of Eshin Grey and Filthy Soot, though you could use a bit of white for this as well. I'm going to use this color to do some simple highlighting on the fur. So starting off, I'm going to cover the entire cloak with the darker of the two colors, the black and gray mix. Next, I'm taking a flat brush and I'm going to go over the top of the arches of the cloak with a lighter color. I'm only getting a small amount on the brush, and it's not a dry brushing, just kind of mashing the lighter color into the darker one. Next, I'm doing a dry brush with some pure filthy soot, and here I'm just focusing this paint on the top parts of the folds in the fabric. After that's had some time to dry, I'm mixing some Nuln Oil and water so the darkening effect of the wash isn't too strong. Areas that I want darker will just receive 2 or 3 coats. I'm starting off by covering the entire cloak with a Nuln Oil and water mix. Next, I'm going to use 1 or more coats on the underside of all the folds to deepen the shadows. Finally, I'm following that up with a final dry brush with the filthy soot. This time I'm being very selective of where it goes and taking my time. I'm next going back to the loincloth and deepening the shadows there with some Agrax Earthshade, much the same way as I just did with the cloak. The Orc Necromancer is wearing 2 belts, at least I think this cinch around the top of his waist is a belt. I'm painting this a dark blue using Kantor Blue. For all the stitching around the belt, I'm using Tallarn Sand. While I've got the Tallarn Sand on my palette, I'm going to use it to paint the inside of the cloak. This is another good place to use the 2 color method I've used on the skin and the outside of the cloak. So for the darker color, I'll just be mixing in a bit of black with the Tallarn Sand until I get a new color that's clearly distinct from the original. So I'm starting off with the dark color, painting in the shadowed areas, and I'm going about halfway up the fold. Next, I'm coming in with the pure Tallarn Sand for the bright areas, and once again just wet blending in where the light and dark meet each other. As a final highlight, I mixed a bit of Ushabti bone into the Tallarn Sand, and I'm just going to make a thin line down the center of each raised fold. I'm also going to use the Tallarn Sand for the wraps around the Necromancer's feet, and for the wrap around the handle of his dagger. For the belts under the loincloth, I'm using Dryad Bark. Next, I'm painting his belt pouch using Deathworld Forest. For all of the gold on the chest and face, I'm using a 1-to-1 mix of Balthazar gold and Vallejo's Glarious gold. I'm starting off with the body piercings, and for the first time in a long time, I'm using a Citadel brush. I normally save my higher quality brushes for extremely fine details. The brush I'm using right now is the extra small Artificer Layer brush. I normally use plastic brushes for almost everything, but they don't hold a sharp tip nearly as well as a hairbrush. I'm also painting the belt buckle with the same gold color mix. And the last bit of gold is this strange chin ornament. Next, I'm painting his staff, the 1-to-1 mix of Ivory and Screaming Skull. I'm going to use the same color on the bone handle of his knife. Now I'm painting all the ornamental rocks hanging from his belt. One of these rocks is actually supposed to be a skull, but the definition on it's so poor that I'm going to paint it to look like a rock as well. For these I'm using a 1-to-1 mix of Mechanicus Standard Grey and Stegadon Scale Green. For the blade of the dagger, I'm using a 1-to-1 mix of Abaddon Black and Pig Iron. On top of his head, he's wearing a bird for a hat. It kind of fits in well with the theme they have going in Massive Darkness with the goblins. Most of them have bird skulls decorating their bodies. I'm using the same as I did for the cloak for this, the Eshin Grey and Abaddon Black mix. For the beak I'm using Averland Sunset. I made it a bit too big initially, but I fixed that later. The next thing I'm painting is all the various straps using Dryad Bark. There's a strap that goes across the left leg and 2 straps down the side of his face. The staff also has what look like rope or leather straps around the center of the staff and more around the head of the staff. And finally, I'm using the Dryad Bark for all the small straps connecting the ornamental rocks to the Necromancer's belt. Next, I'm painting the eyes and the teeth. I'm using my Artificer Layer brush again for this, since the eyes and teeth are tiny. I'm using Ceremite White on these to make them stand out. That's the end of the base colors. Now it's time to do the rest of the shading and highlighting. I'm starting off with Agrax Earthshade, and I'm using this on the staff and the foot and dagger wraps. I'm also using this on a few smaller spots, like the bone handle of the dagger, the stitching on the blue belt, all over the brown belt with the gold buckle, and the belt pouch. I'm also going to use this to define the line across the center of the chin ornament. You could also use the Agrax on the rest of the gold, but I'll be using a different color later. The next shade I'm using is Nuln Oil. I'm applying this shade to the bird on his head, the blade of his dagger, and all the ornamental rocks on his waist. For the next shade, I'm going to be using two brushes at once. One will have just water on it, and the other will be for Druchii Violet. Druchii Violet is a dark shade that stains pretty strongly, so I'm first going to use the water brush to dampen the area I'll be applying the wash. This way, when the wash hits, less of it will stay on the raised surfaces and more of it will pool into the recesses. I'm also actively focusing on the grooves between the muscles and trying not to get any on the muscles themselves. If I do get a little too much on the muscle, however, I'll switch to my damp brush and just wipe it away or blend it in. So once again, you can see I'm first going over the body with the damp brush and then switching to the shade. I'm also using this shade all over the gold on his chest and abdomen and around the edges on his chin ornament. Near the face, I'm trying not to get any on the eyes or the teeth, but some touch-up is definitely going to be inevitable. The shading is done, and now it's time for the first highlight. The wraps on the feet and the dagger are getting a very simple dry brush highlight with the original Tallarn Sand. For the bone staff and dagger, I'll be doing 1 to 2 passes of dry brushing with Flayed One Flesh. The bird on his head is getting a dry brush with Eshin Grey. Now for all of your highlights, you could certainly do another dry brush with a lighter color to really make the edges pop. In tutorial videos, however, I rarely do more than 2 layers of highlight just to keep the video under an hour. For the belt pouch, I've mixed a 2-to-1 blend of Deathworld Forest and Ogryn Camo, and I'm just cleaning this up. I'm leaving shade in the edges around the straps on the bag. For all the rocks hanging from his belt, I'm doing a reapplication of the Mechanicus Standard Grey and Stegadon Scale Green mix, but only in the top surface of the rocks. Next, I'm going to mix in an equal amount of Sotek Green and do a slightly brighter highlight on the bottom edges of the rocks. I wasn't 100% happy with the highlighting on the loincloth, so I'm doing one final edge highlight with pure XV88. For the knife, I'm using Stormhost Silver to paint a rough edge on both sides of the blade. Next, I'm using some pure Tallarn Sand just to trace over the stitching on the blue belt. For the gold parts, I'm first going to reapply the Glarious Gold and Balthazar mix over the chin ornament. Next, I'm going to paint the top half or so with pure Glarious Gold, and then use this same color to highlight all the piercings. And all I'm doing for this is covering the upturned surfaces of the rings and the edges of the nipple piercings. Finally, I'm going to mix in a small amount of shining silver with the Glarious Gold, and I'm going to use this to paint a thin line of reflection down the center of the chin ornament. So the next step is to highlight the skin. We've saved ourselves a lot of work by doing the 2 skin tones at the beginning, but now I'm going to clean up the skin and give a slightly brighter highlight. I'm using pure Slaanesh Grey as the brightest highlight, and roughly equal parts Slaanesh Grey and Xereus Purple for the darker highlight. So starting off, I'm using the pure Slaanesh Grey where I got too much Druchii Violet on the skin, and brightening the upper surfaces of the muscles to make them stand out a bit better. For all the areas that were painted with the darker skin tone, I'm using the darker highlight, just slowly building up some layers on the muscle so you can see the definition. I'm constantly switching back and forth between the 2 highlight colors. Like here with the fingers, they are mostly the darker color, so they're getting the darker highlight. However, the top finger is brighter, so it's getting the brightest highlight. The face is the only place I used a different color for highlighting. For the nose and the cheeks, I used some pure Genestealer Purple. So that's all the highlighting done, and now I'm just going to add a few final touches. I'm going to put some tribal war paint onto the Necromancer using Sotek Green and Moot Green. I'm starting off with a 1-to-1 mix of Sotek Green and Moot Green as a base color for the war paint. I'm just picking a few spots that don't have a lot of detail and filling them in with some stripes or random patterns. Once again, I'm using my smallest Citadel brush. This thing is getting a lot of mileage in this video. I'm starting off with some rings of color around the arms, much like you see in the character art. In the character art, the entire top half of the face is covered in greenish paint, but I don't want to obscure all that detail, so I'm just going to go with some stripes over the eye sockets instead. There's also a small patch of green just above the chin ornament that I'm painting in. For the chest, one of his pecs is perfect for some more war paint, so I'm going to sketch a pattern on here. Once that's done, I'm going to switch to Moot Green and trace over the exact same spots as the darker green. Finally, for the eyes, I'm going to dab them with a bit of Casandora Yellow just to give them a yellowish tint. Now it's time for the base. I'm painting this base to match the ones I've been doing for Massive Darkness, since that's the most likely place I'll be using this miniature. I'm starting off by covering the whole thing with Mechanicus Standard Grey, and then I'm drawing square stones onto the floor. Next, just like with the other miniatures, I'm using an assortment of greys to create a little variation of color. Then I'll finish up by painting a dark rim around the base. And once everything is dried, I'm giving it a spray with Tester's Dull Coat. And here's the finished product. A special thank you to all my patrons who are supporting this channel. If you want to join the community and be part of the decision making for which miniatures get painted next, check me out on Patreon. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching.